one has ever clapped for me before. That's exciting. Good evening. My name is Michael Nock, and on behalf of the Mackin-Mailander Lecture Committee, I would like to welcome you to this evening with Clarke Faculty Emeritus Norm Freund. Thank you so much for joining us. Before I get into my introduction, I just want to ask and remind you to please silence your cell phones so that, we don't have any interruptions with that. The Mackin-Mailander Lecture Series was established in 1997 after Clarke received gifts from Mary Mackin and Verna Slattery Mailander to establish an endowed lecture series. The lecture series throughout the year features prominent outside speakers, faculty, and alumni lectures. A few notes about our talk tonight. Norm's talk is titled Clarke Lives, the Story of the 1984 Fire. He will speak for around 50 minutes, and then we will open it up for question and answer. We'll follow that up with some light refreshments and some more conversation out in the atrium. Oh, and before I forget, we do still have a few copies of Clarke Lives. If you would like a copy of that book and you get out there fast enough, you can have a free copy of that book, which the bookstore has generously donated to us. The theme for our arts and lecture offerings this academic year is Clarke Lives. There are few events that tie longtime Dubuquers and Clarkies together like the Clarke Fire, which tore through campus about 40 years ago in May of 1984. Nearly everyone who was in town at that time can tell you where they were when they saw or heard that Clarke was burning. What could have been a disaster, however, has turned into a rallying cry of our school's strength and resilience. That strength became obvious when, in the aftermath of the fire, students hung the iconic Clarke Lives sign from the doorway of the Margaret Mann Administrative Building. That sign and that phrase became a declaration that their college and their community were not going anywhere. When the Mackin-Mailander committee members set about brainstorming who might be a good faculty speaker for this special year of commemorations, our thoughts turned immediately to Norm Freund. Norm was in his third year at Clarke when the fire broke out a few days before the 1984 commencement ceremony. He would go on to teach philosophy at Clarke for another 37 years, and in that time his classes became famous across campus for their rigor and their popularity. I personally can attest to one time in my early days here at Clarke when I saw a student of mine in class looking just a little bit frazzled, a little bit nervous, and I stopped and asked, "Is everything okay?" And she said, "I have a norm test today." That was all I needed to know. Outside of Clarke, Norm and his wife Maribeth have become BVM associates, and Norm also teaches at the Roberta Kuhn Center at Mount Carmel, and like me, he is a long-suffering fan of the Minnesota Vikings. He also has graciously agreed to be our faculty speaker this evening, and so please join me in welcoming Clarke Faculty Emeritus Norm Freund.
Thank you, Professor Nock, for your very kind introduction. And I want to give a special shout out thank you to three people who made possible the images that we'll see tonight as I run through my presentation. So a thank you to Paul Karutsides, to Gail Langle, and also to Sue Leibel. Without their expertise, these images which accompany my talk would not be possible. Additionally, I am profoundly grateful to the Clarke community in general and the BVM sisters in particular. 43 years ago this March, the confidence they placed in me made possible my dream career here for the next 4 decades. And if that hadn't happened, then somebody else would be giving this talk tonight. This is an iconic aerial photograph, the first known aerial photograph of the campus, taken by biplane in 1928. I would draw your attention to a couple of things. All these buildings here are the ones that were affected by the fire that I'll be talking about tonight. And look how forested the campus was back then and how remote we were, still out of town in 1928. Before I begin, I want to share with you that while I have given many presentations on the history and the heritage of Clarke University, this one is personal. It is more than history to me. It is a lived experience. Many emotions run deep for me regarding the fire and its aftermath. This despite the passage of nearly 4 decades since the event. Please excuse me if that emotion comes across as I proceed. I want to begin with this vignette. It was a spring day in May when fire consumed the campus. Before it could be extinguished, the chapel, living spaces of the BVM sisters, and areas used by the students would be destroyed. And the year? 1849. Yep, Clarke burned down twice. The first time was when we were located at the Prairie Mother House site, and the second time on this, our 5th, and I assume final location. And if you are interested in a little bit of the eerie, if you transpose the digits in 1849, you get 1984. Tonight's presentation will not revolve around that first fire, rather the one that occurred 40 years ago this spring, a time of living memory for a number of us. In covering this pivotal time in Clarke's history, I will be transitioning through 3 stages. First, our heritage buildings. Second, conflagration. And lastly, resurrection. Heritage buildings. In the late 1870s, we were still called St. Joseph's Academy. We educated female students through the high school diploma, and we were located on 13th and Main Streets, across from what is now Mario's Restaurant. And that institution was busting at the seams. It served as both a day school for commuters and a boarding school for on-campus students. With enrollment at its peak, a decision was made to move the boarding students to a new location, which would come to be called Mount St. Joseph Academy. That is until 1928, when it was renamed Clarke College. That old school downtown would remain open for day students only, and actually would continue in existence until Wahlert Catholic High School opened in the late 1950s. William J. Knight, a Dubuque attorney and trusted friend of Mother Clarke, recommended the purchase of this land, then 2 miles out of town, on a hill which was the site of mining operations. The land lacked city utilities and was pocketed with stubby weeds and yellow dirt piles from the mining. Despite all these drawbacks, it made the land affordable. And in time, the city would grow outward to this new location. And so it was on September 8th, 1879, Father McGrath, the priest president of what would become Loras College, and 2 BVM representatives of Mary Frances Clarke traveled to the site and chose the location for that first building. We are seated tonight only 100 feet from that very spot. Over the next 12 years, a total of 3 heritage buildings plus a magnificent chapel would be constructed on this campus. All would eventually be destroyed in the 1984 fire. The first of these buildings was begun in the fall of 1879 and was completed early in 1881. It was designed by architect Freund Joseph Hare, who would later design the Dubuque County Courthouse. Modeled after the French and Renaissance style of architecture, the exterior consisted of red pressed bricks, as well as stone caps and trimmings. The top floor was graced by a slate mansard roof with a wrought iron border. A central feature were two towers that graced the left and right facade and were topped with Celtic crosses, which signify the Irish heritage of the founding BVM sisters. Within each tower were open wooden staircases stretching from basement to the top floor. As the original building on this campus, it contained everything necessary for a boarding academy. This included living space for sisters and students alike, a library, a study hall, reception room and parlor, kitchen, dining room, art and music halls, and a third-floor chapel for worship. It was state-of-the-art at the time in that it had central steam heating, meaning the many fireplaces that were originally in that building were largely for aesthetic purposes. And as can be seen in photographs, the first floor interior was chock-full stained glass in both the drawing room and the solarium, which was added to the building in the 1930s. See all the stained glass in that space. Lacking city utilities, except for electricity, we wouldn't have water and sewer utilities here until the 1920s. There was much creativity put into play as well. The top of each tower contained an 1,800-gallon tank. A nearby windmill was built over a spring. It pumped water into the towers, and then gravity flow carried it throughout the building. As for a septic system, well, a line was run to one of the abandoned mine shafts initially. Don't tell the city about that. Of course, the city wasn't here then. Early benefactor William J. Knight sought to beautify the campus by donating 1,000 small trees, most of which were pines. By the 1920s, their growth had made the campus a veritable forested enclave, with multiple pine walks gracing the campus. Remnants of these trees remain to this very day. So you see the line of young trees here? You're wondering what this is. That's the wash house where all the laundry was done back then. And then this is what the trees look like 35 years later. See the walkway. Enrollment grew so quickly that an academy wing was begun just a few years after completion of the main building. It was built onto the original building just to the southwest. This initiated a tradition at Clarke of connecting one building to another as the campus expanded. Freund Hare was again the architect, and the design matched the first building, yielding the appearance that it was one structure. So there it shows the expansion just a few years after the initial building with the second building. The ground floor of that building contained a multi-purpose assembly space, which served as an auditorium, a theater, a music hall, and in the winter it was a recreation space. It was this space that would first have electrical lighting on the campus, which replaced gas lighting beginning in 1909. Much later, in 1969, this assembly space was converted into the music hall. Now, this is a photo of the music hall 90 years later. Now, if I go back, you see the structural supports. The only steel in this building were structural supports here. You see the three. Same three. Same three. There's an interesting story about the excavation to create the descending theater-style floor during the renovation in 1969, which put the music hall there. It was discovered when they tore up the floor that an old mine shaft was beneath the floor. The workers in the 1880s had simply put the floor over the open mine shaft. It took 86 tons of gravel to fill the 6-foot wide and 40-foot deep hole that they discovered. On the first floor of the wing, a large study hall faced the street, and it continued to serve as such into the 1950s. Yes, there were study halls at Clarke into the 1950s. On the top floor, a large chapel replaced a smaller one in the original building. This space was later converted to student housing in the 1950s. That's the original chapel from the expanded building. It was here, on the outside fire escape, that Sister Xavier Cohen's BVM caught a first-year student from Bellevue smoking. That student's name was Carol Blitchen. For those of you who do not know, this is the future Sister Carol Blitchen, BVM, who would serve 50 years in the Clarke Drama Department. Years later, faculty office space replaced the student living space on that third floor. When you have buildings this old, many of the interior spaces were different things over a period of time. My office was located on this south side of the building at the time of the fire. It was the fourth window from the left. That's my old office, 367 Rose O'Toole. I still have the key to that office. It's in my pocket tonight. In the mid-1880s, an advertisement for the Academy appeared in the Mount St. Joseph Messenger. There was a drawing in that advertisement, and you can see the iconic towers of the original building and the wing to the right. However, the drawing shows a reciprocal wing to the left as well, one that was never built. What was all that about? Let's read between the lines a bit. When the campus next expanded in the early 1890s, money was tight in the BVM congregation, for it had committed to build Mount Carmel in Dubuque at the end of Grandview Avenue at the same time. Thus, a more modest building was constructed here. It was located where the Keller Computer Center parking lot is today. Though freestanding, it was connected to the other buildings via an enclosed bridge on its second floor. This proved to be the most versatile of all the buildings constructed at Clarke. First, it was a guest house and conservatory. Then, from 1915 to 1924, it was a dormitory, the first Mary Frances Clarke Hall. In 1924, it was equipped for science and remodeled as such by Conlin Construction in 1938. It would continue to serve as a science building until the new one opened in 1965. Some would know this first science building as Old CBH. It was demolished the year that New Catherine Byrne Hall opened. That's a photo of the building from the early 1960s after the bridgeway had been removed. By the waning years of the 19th century, plans were underway for the greatest expansion in the institution's history. Always visionaries, the BVM sisters foresaw the need for a college division to be added to the academy. This would assist the sisters in getting the higher education they needed for their teaching, and would also meet the needs of a growing concern for educating lay women beyond the high school level. If you look at this photo from our back campus, the college building is everything from this end all the way over to this end. And of course, the chapel is on the front. Originally called the college building, it was constructed west of the academy wing to which it was connected. Counting its lower levels, it rose to 5 stories in height. The lowest level consisted of the original campus gymnasium. Now, I know there are a lot of students here. This is not much as a gym for contemporary students. What interests me most in this picture of our original gymnasium, this is a punching bag in the wall. Apparently the sisters taught self-defense, part of the students. On the first floor was the library, with second and third floors mainly being dormitory space, while a smaller round occupied first and second floor of the building on the street side. The back of the building featured an enormous round from basement to rooftop. You can see that here. Clearly, though, the most prominent feature of the building was a large chapel of Gothic and Romanesque architecture, built at a right angle to the main building on the street side of campus. It was styled after the Cathedral of Worms in Europe and given the name of Sacred Heart Chapel. A prominent feature were its twin spires on either side of the apse, each capped with a 6-foot-tall Celtic cross. For generations, these spires symbolized the college and were a backdrop on official college stationery at the time of the fire in 1984. The chapel was entered via the first floor hallway and consisted of a long nave with the main pews on either side of the center aisle. On the outside of those pews was a smaller aisle with adjacent cloister pews. For generations, sisters sat in those cloister pews, keeping a watchful eye on the students in the main pews, making sure that no shenanigans were going on during Mass. As late as the 1960s, students wore academic attire to Mass on Sundays, though some of those alums attest to the fact that they were wearing pajamas underneath. It was in this very space that Maribeth and I had our firstborn, Joshua Thomas, baptized in 1982. In this photograph is Sister Mary Ellen Caldwell, now deceased. She's Josh's godmother. Paul Fairst, his godfather, and Maribeth and I, and Father Bob Beck, who was the campus chaplain at that time. Beneath the chapel was the original dining room, though this space had become part of the library by the late 1950s. And again, if you look closely, all gas lighting in the early decades of these old buildings. Not far from the chapel entrance was a grand wooden staircase stretching 4 stories tall. Its most prominent feature was a large rose window facing south. The sun would cascade upon all those who passed by, going to and from their daily task. And the window well was deep enough that students could adorn a statue of Mary there during Advent and the Christmas season. Well, this is why I asked Paul when we ran through it if he had extra batteries. Oh, there we go. Okay. Okay. This is a picture from 1950. So students at Clarke in 1950. Thanks to a donation from a Mrs. James Mullen, the back of the new building was graced with a campus shrine, the Grotto of Our Lady of Lourdes. For more than 60 years, May crownings were annual events at this grotto. There we go. You can see there was a lot of events that were conducted in academic attire. And so several grand buildings were constructed on this campus in its first 20 years. However, they remained unnamed until 1952. On College Day that year, certain BVM sisters were honored in a naming ceremony. Each building received a bronze plaque in the naming, some of which continue to grace the campus today. This appears to have been the idea of Crescentia Thornton, BVM, who was our college dean at that time. On that day, the original academy building, by then serving as an administration building, was named in honor of Margaret Mann, BVM, one of the original sisters. The old academy wing was named in honor of Rose O'Toole, BVM, also one of the original 5. And the library and chapel building became Mary Bertrand Hall, for it was Mary Bertrand, BVM, who oversaw our becoming a college and who served as our first collegiate president. Before bidding adieu to these heritage buildings, a word must be said about the college corridor, which became known as the carpeted hallway after the hardwood floors were covered up in the 1960s. Reflecting the philosophy of community and connectedness, each new building built over time was connected up to one of the older ones. At its zenith, the central first floor hallway extended unbroken from the west end of Mary Bertrand Hall to the entrance of Catherine Byrne Hall in the east. This was an expanse of nearly 2 football fields in length. And it bustled with life as students traveled from dorms to classes and then back again. The only way to tell which building you were in when you were actually in the hallway were the glass transoms above that separated one building from the other. Oop. This is a photograph from the 1920s. In what proved to be a prophetic 1-page article published in the Clarke Labyrinth in 1912, student Jeanette Beeran had the following to say, and I quote, "The college corridor. How often when treading the immense length of the college corridor, we wonder what stories the walls could tell if they could speak. But their smooth or paneled surfaces defy a prying into secrets, and we are left with our own imagination. Year after year, new girls and old promenade up and down, some to be remembered, others to be forgotten. Yet they do not forget the many happy hours spent there. This dear hall has been the scene of many joys and some few sorrows. Who has not sat in the alcove of the Sacred Heart and poured out her soul to a sympathetic listener? Who has not stood looking out of the windows upon the beautiful scenes before her? Besides being a delightful promenade for the winter evenings, an air of knowledge pervades the place. For opening from it are the study halls, the college library, the English hall, and the chapel, where we often kneel to pray. The pictures, the statues are all of interest to the passers-by. The girls whose merry laughter, whose joys and sorrows are constant companions of this dear corridor, and will be till its walls silently say goodbye. Conflagration. The week of the fire, a pivotal meeting occurred involving Clarke BVMs. It was held in the solarium of Margaret Mann Hall, pictured here. Consideration was being made to remodel the interior spaces of these historic buildings and transform them to more contemporary student use. Active and retired sisters at that time lived on third floor of Mary Bertrand Hall, as well as second and third floor of Margaret Mann Hall. It had been a long-standing BVM tradition for sisters to live on campus at their educational institutions, whether they were active or retired. Said remodeling would mean the end of BVM's house there. It was not an easy conversation. Shortly, the issue would be moot. Whoop. Well, there we go. When the sun rose on May 17, 1984, it was already a day of history at Clarke. 56 years before, on May 17, 1928, also a Thursday, groundbreaking occurred for a new auditorium and recreation building, now called Terence Donahue Hall. It was the last spring we were still Mount St. Joseph College. We would be called Clarke College in a few months. All the college's sisters and students were present, with the students wearing either mortar boards or white veils. Distinguished guests included Archbishop Kane, the presidents of both Loras and Mount St. Joseph colleges, and Mother Isabella Kane, the Superior General of the BVM congregation. Before May 17, 1984 was through, the date would be historic for a much different reason. Those Ides of May marked the end of the spring semester. Monday through Thursday had been examination days, and graduation was scheduled for Saturday. Those waning semester days were also marked by re-roofing of all those old heritage buildings. Much pounding by workers on the roof, with dust settling down from the third floor ceilings, had been happening. I was an assistant professor of philosophy, completing my third year of service at Clarke. I was all of 30 years old. Late morning on the 17th, I packed up my briefcase and headed off from my third floor office to administer my last exam of the year. I entered the Rose O'Toole Hall stairwell and headed down. Remembering an escapade from a few days earlier, I chuckled. I had found out that that famous tunnel connecting the Heritage Buildings to Mary Frances Hall on the other side of the street was still open on the Margaret Mann side. Then I discovered the dark entrance to that tunnel in the basement of that building. I flipped the light switch, but there was nothing but darkness. Someone had judiciously disconnected the lights to discourage explorers such as myself. Gingerly, I stepped forward, experiencing the downward slope of the floor. Doing so, my surroundings were getting darker and darker as I took steps forward and downward. I stopped suddenly when I found my feet stepping into water. Oh well, after my grades were in on Tuesday, I would return with a flashlight and continue my exploration. I reached first floor and entered that famous carpeted hallway and headed east towards my CBH classroom. The floor creaked with the antiguity of 5 generations of students who had studied at Clarke. Their spirits echoed in my ears as I passed their photographs on my left and my right, from the class of 1881 through that of 1983. The soon-to-be graduates of the class of 1984 would be added in a few weeks. In my years at Clarke, I had walked that hallway hundreds of times. Today would be my last. The final student to complete my exam turned his tests into me in room 205A, CBH, just before the fire alarm sounded. Now, fire alarms can go off for lots of different reasons. Sometimes as drills, occasionally by accident, and, as had happened earlier that week at Clarke, as a prank. Nonetheless, I dutifully packed up and quickly exited the building on the back side of Catherine Byrne Hall. Everything looked usual on the outside of that building, as it did for Eliza Kelly Hall to my right. So I curled around, expecting to see the same when I came to the old academy building. What I saw there stopped me in my tracks. For across the top floor of the mansard roof of Margaret Mann Hall, white smoke could be seen seeping from the slate tiles. Now, all those old, aged buildings were brick and stone on the outside, but wood and masonry inside, which were all flammable. In the early decades, there had been many open wooden staircases, gas lighting, fireplaces, and candle lighting ceremonies, including in the decorated rose window, and never a fire of significance. On May 17, 1984, it was spontaneous combustion that did us in. No roofing work had been done on that day. It had been completed, but unused products from the work would have to wait to be removed later. In the meantime, they were all piled together on the roof of the middle building, my building, Rose O'Toole Hall. There they were covered with a tarp. May 17th was a hot, muggy, and windy day. As the sun beat down, the materials under the tarp began to combust. Eventually, the roof itself was breached, and the smoldering fire entered the attic. There, 100-year-old bone-dry wood awaited. Now, over the years, fire safety improvements had been implemented in these aged buildings. As early as the 1950s, 2 wooden staircases had been removed, and the grand open staircase with a rose window converted to a fire-safe stairwell. Safety standards, however, did not extend into the attic. After all, no one worked or lived in the attic. And so, with each new building that had been constructed, its attic was connected to the attic of the pre-existing building. Once a fire entered the attic of Rose O'Toole Hall, it spread quickly east to the attic of Margaret Mann Hall, as well as west across the connection way to Mary Bertrand Hall and the adjoining chapel. When the firefighters first arrived, the fire had not yet breached the attic. It could only be attacked from within. When firefighters broke through the third floor ceilings to get to the fire, it was already like a blast furnace within. That attic fire was starved for oxygen. There were only a couple of feet of attic above my third floor Rose O'Toole office, so it didn't remain there. And consequently, my office was spared. In Margaret Mann Hall, however, the attic fire breached the towers and open staircase, where it could travel to other parts of the building. But the greatest destruction of all was in the library and chapel building, Mary Bertrand Hall. There the fire found 20 feet of attic and 20 feet of oxygen above the Sacred Heart Chapel. The fire quickly breached to the outside here as well, and a fireball 40 feet in height extended from the Mary Bertrand Hall round. One photo of this fireball, and all of those photos were taken from the Dubuque Senior parking lot, show the Dubuque Senior baseball team practicing for a game, and no one was looking at the fire. I guess life goes on. This fire raged out of control for many hours, and there were spot fires that had to be put out for a long time after that. There are so many stories of the fire, as many stories as there were people there that day. I hope some of them come forward in the question and answer time after my talk. During the most intense part of the fire, many in the Clarke community, including BVM sisters, gathered across the street in front of Mary Frances Hall. There they consoled one another. A photographer captured retired Sister Constantia Fox gazing up with tears in her eyes as the place that had been her home for 60 years burned. The rest of my day was solitary, which really wasn't very healthy. In retrospect, I was in shock. Multiple times over multiple hours, I circled by myself the entire campus, paying special attention to my third floor office window. At one point, I could see the blind in my window burst into flames. One third of the campus burned down that day. I wondered if I would have a job in the fall. Then it occurred to me, my wife, Maribeth, she was student teaching that day at Resurrection School. She must be frantic, wondering if I am okay. Remember, this is long before there are any cell phones. There was, however, an outside phone at the Mary Josita Hall entrance back then. So I called the school and asked for my wife to be pulled out of the classroom. When she got to the phone, I could sense worry and perhaps a bit of irritation in her voice. I told her not to worry, that I was fine. Her reply was, Why wouldn't you be? She didn't know about the fire yet. I suggested that when she returned to the classroom, she looked east, that the gigantic plume of black smoke she would see was Clarke burning down. Later in the day, a liturgy was held in a safe adjoining Clarke building. Unfortunately, I missed that. Father Beck, our chaplain, who had been there all day ministering to those in distress, said the Mass. This is the same priest who had baptized our son Joshua just a year and a half before. The chalice used for the consecration had been salvaged earlier that day from the destroyed chapel. One of the last things actively burning at that time was the east spire of the Sacred Heart Chapel. Remember, those spires were the symbol of Clarke College. As the priest raised the cup in the consecration, that spire collapsed. Resurrection. Before shifting to our ascendance from the flames, like the mythical phoenix, some blessings from the fire need to be voiced. Yes, there were blessings. Almost all fires burn upwards, which is the natural tendency of flames. Ours, having started on the roof, could only burn downwards from a place where there were no people. And our fire was in the middle of the day. Fires that begin overnight on lower floors can be real killers. No one died or was seriously injured in the 1984 fire. Also, consider this. If you were to pick a day of the year to have your college burned down, you would pick the last day of the spring semester, because then you have all summer to recover. Additionally, you would not want the fire to destroy any dormitories or classroom buildings. All this was true for us. There was heroism that May 17th as well. Heroism on the part of the firefighters from Dubuque and neighboring communities who risked their well-being on the day of the worst fire in the city's history. A number of them suffered from smoke inhalation and exhaustion. Heroism, too, from members of our Clarke community, including Steve Q and Daryl Detmeyer of Facilities Management. The firefighters had no familiarity with the labyrinth hallways and irregular rooms of the old buildings, many of whose doors were locked. Armed with keys and knowledge of the burning buildings, they escorted those fighting the fire to where they needed to go inside. At one point, the first floor ceiling of the carpeted hallway collapsed in front of Steve, where Daryl had been walking just moments before. He feared Daryl was under the pile of debris. Fortunately, he had turned down a Margaret Mann hallway just moments before. With all the water that was poured upon those old roofs, Steve said there was the unsettling phenomenon of water falling from the ceiling above like rain. And its temperature, warm as bath water, because of all the hot coals that had filtered through to get to first floor. In the days ahead, Steve Q would be clearing out debris from the damaged carpeted hallway. The first floor bridge that had connected Eliza Kelly Hall to Margaret Mann Hall had been purposely destroyed with a backhoe during the fire to prevent the fire from spreading to the conservatory building. Remember that the last part of the buildings to be consumed in flame was the East Chapel spire. But the West spire did not burn and would serve as our inspiration for recovery. That recovery actually began during the fire. If I were asked to name just one person who got us beyond this disaster and then guided us throughout the rebuilding, it would be Sister Catherine Dunn, BVM. Now, Catherine had been president at Clarke less than a full semester when this conflagration occurred. Talk about being tested in fire, literally. While Clarke burned, she was ticking through her head all the things that would need to be done to ensure the institution's survival, and then set about accomplishing them. And somehow, she kept that white dress free of soot and ash when it was everywhere that day. If we had not had a BVM president at the time of the fire, the reasoning might have gone something like this. It's a tough time in higher ed. A third of the campus has been destroyed. The insurance payment can be used to settle any campus debts. So why not just close up shop? Clarke College ceasing to exist was never, let me say that again, never a consideration for Sister Catherine. When I returned home the evening of the fire and had finished picking up the partially burned papers that had drifted from Clarke into my backyard, I turned on the local news. There was Sister Catherine sharing that the Board of Trustees had been contacted and Clarke would rebuild. Graduation would occur in 44 hours as scheduled, and summer school would start on Monday. All of this happened. The shock and depression I had endured earlier in the day was lifted like a weight from my shoulders. At graduation, Catherine received a standing ovation. Soon after the fire, students hung a spray-painted sign in front of Margaret Mann Hall. It proclaimed, "Clarke lives." The slogan actually dated to the 70s, when Clarke was considering whether to stay a women's institution or not. Now it had new meaning. Both of these are former students of mine. Getting things done, and in the order they had to be done, was a big part of our recovery. More than 100 works of art had been in the old buildings, many of them the creations of our own campus artists. Sister Joan Ling and BVM of the art department set about cataloging what had been destroyed and what could be saved. The registrar's office, like a number of other offices, had not been destroyed by fire, but had been inundated with water. Louisa Tavi, Marguerite Newman, BVM, and many others sought to dry out vital papers in the sun in the day after the fire. Because all the diplomas of the impending graduates had been stored in that same office, the printing company graciously ran a whole new set before Saturday's graduation. Now, those of us whose spaces had survived in the burned buildings were given strictly a few minutes' time to retrieve items from our rooms, subject to it being safe getting there and back in the first place. And so I ascended the fire-safe stairwell of Mary Bertrand Hall. When I exited the stairwell at the third floor, there was nothing but sky above me. To my left, that's where this photo is aimed, was where third floor of Mary Bertrand Hall had been. Only the chimneys remained to designate that there had been a third floor there at all. To my right was the third floor Rose O'Toole hallway. It had obviously seen better days. Now, at the end of that hallway, an overwhelmed Sister Josepha Carton, BVM, stood in her small office. Oh well, my things could wait. I helped her out first. I wouldn't be done in a few minutes after all. Please don't tell Catherine. My office had tremendous water damage, but was intact. The heat there, though, had been intense. All the plants were dead, and the bindings of the books in my bookcases permanently discolored as a result of the intense heat upon them. I began to prioritize my salvage list. First, I packed up all the notes for the courses I taught. They were invaluable for the continuation of my teaching. Second, I turned to personal items. On my bulletin board was a large photograph of Joshua and I, which a student had taken outside our duplex the year before. Yep, the same son who had been baptized 18 months before in the now destroyed chapel. I noticed that the photo had started to burn in the lower left-hand corner as my office had approached kindling temperature. Miraculously, the burning had stopped. That was a keeper. This guy may look familiar to you. Also a keeper was a cross-stitch rendition of me teaching, which my wife had created for me a few years before. And the final thing I took, it was a window air conditioner. I had bargained with the academic dean for 9 months to get an air conditioner up there because I always taught summer school and it was dreadfully hot. I didn't know if my next office would have AC or not, and I was not going to leave it just sitting there in the window. That unit was eventually gifted to my colleague, Ken Anderson. Until the day that unit stopped working, it always smelled of smoke when you first turned it on. There is no justice in a fire. Virtually nothing of value was lost from my office. It was a different story from my colleague down the hall, Sister Sarah McAlpin, BVM. Her office was a hole all the way down to the first floor. And her bedroom in the adjoining third floor Mary Bertrand Hall was also a total loss. In the space of an afternoon, she had lost all of her professional and personal belongings except for the clothes on her back. And she was not the only one. Our library, being in the lower levels of Mary Bertrand Hall, had not burned, but there was severe water damage there. Wet books had to be freeze-dried quickly to prevent any mold in the text. Newly appointed head librarian Paul Roberts spearheaded this effort. Members from both the Clarke and Greater Dubuque communities formed book passing lines. Now, if you want a real sense of how many books there are in a library, try passing them all out of the library to a truck, person to person, 2 or 3 books at a time. So many area people helped Clarke out in the days and weeks after the fire that the college provided a thank you picnic on the back campus that summer as a way of expressing gratitude. Level-headed thinking was needed in the early days of resurrection as well. Very soon after the fire, The insurance company appeared with a check to settle for damages. That settlement was at a fraction of the value of the burned buildings. It assumed they were merely damaged and not destroyed. Sister Catherine was not going to have any of that. While the buildings looked repairable from the ground on the outside, the view from above told a very different story. In order to get the full value of the buildings, considerable money was spent by the college for a renowned fire testing firm to conduct extensive interior and exterior testing. Their determination was that the buildings could not be salvaged. Eventually, the insurance company paid full value on these buildings. This extended legal process, however, took many months. Summer extended deep into fall before it was complete. Until then, no demolishing of the buildings could occur. Imagine trying to attract a new incoming class for the following year to Clarke when the remains of the burned buildings, smelling of smoke and mold, occupied the center of the campus untouched. Finally, by late fall of 1984, deconstruction began. Prior to demolition, though, hand-carved stone from the exterior of the Sacred Heart Chapel was carefully removed. This, along with the saved stained glass from within the buildings, would be reused in building projects on the campus for the next quarter century. Our heritage buildings were gone, but parts of them remained and were integrated into future structures. The new Sacred Heart Chapel, which is the spiritual and geographical center of our campus, expresses much of and exhibits much of this glass and stone. And so the fire of the spring of '84 was followed by demolition over the winter and spring of '84-'85. Here, a forlorn statue of Mary gazed upon the destroyed buildings as they were torn down. Stored away safely for more than 20 years, this statue, named Our Lady of the Moonlight, now graces the entranceway to our shrub library. In the meantime, plans for rebuilding and replacing what was lost were formed. This was a time of great excitement on our campus. Administrators, faculty, staff, and students all participated in this. For example, students wanted a courtyard incorporated into the new buildings, which is not too practical at our latitude. The compromise was to create the atrium. Additionally, while so much life had traversed that interior hallway of the old buildings, none of it was visible from the street. The new buildings would have large windows facing the street, with a hallway placed along them. The 1985-1986 academic year would be the year of building the new. But first, official groundbreaking needed to occur. And exuberant Sister Catherine led that way. Quite a bit of ground was broken by this bulldozer. And then the skeletal frames of the new buildings began going up. Obviously, vital space lost in the old buildings would have to be incorporated into the new. This involved many offices, including those of the president, dean, registrar, alumni relations, and admissions. The old music hall in that lower level of Rose O'Toole became this wonderful space that we occupy this evening. Classrooms that could also serve as labs for art and music were constructed nearby as well. Oop. There we go. And the new chapel would bear the name of the old, Sacred Heart. Stone brackets, carefully removed from the spires, can be seen here gracing its corners. And the beautiful rose window of 1902 stands majestically above that upper room. There would also be a relocation of the art gallery and bookstore from Mary Josita Hall to the enlarged and enhanced space off the atrium plaza. Another prominent feature was the new library. The old one had been located in what had originally been the dining room, kitchen, and gymnasium of Mary Bertrand Hall. Like other area libraries and nearly all libraries across the country, the old library had a physical card catalog. Our new library was state-of-the-art with a computerized system of searching for books, articles, and periodicals long before that was common in this country. The transformation of the campus was extraordinary in just a few short years. Consider, for example, the class of 1987 at Clarke. This was the class of Amy Gohm, one of my former students, and a babysitter for Maribeth and I. Yeah, that would be for Josh again. After graduating, Amy joined the BVM congregation. Her first year at Clarke featured all those wonderful heritage buildings. Sophomore year was dominated by gutted and then demolished remains. A very dusty junior year saw new buildings arise from the contoured soil of the old. And senior year, Amy and her classmates enjoyed these new buildings. So what was learned from all these changes in the 1980s? For one, from something devastating and tragic, something very good can come. Clarke emerged from the fire stronger, better, and more equipped to meet the needs of contemporary students. And once again, we witness BVM gumption and dedication at work. In Webster's dictionary, between the words imposition and impost, you will find the word impossible. In BVM vocabulary, there's no such word. This never say die attitude was embodied in Sister Catherine Dunn and so many others, from conflagration through resurrection to this very day. As our cornerstone on the replacement buildings proclaims, our future rests on the foundations of our heritage, a heritage rooted in the Sisters of Charity of the Blessed Virgin Mary. I began this talk by sharing how personal this fire story is for me. I want to conclude with something personal as well. I have been, for a very long time, a play it safe kind of guy. In 1984, a 10-year decision for me was still years away. As a result, I was still renting academic attire. Why, after all, make that investment if my academic career didn't pan out? You can't exactly wear a cap and gown anywhere. On the home front, Maribeth and I were still renting a duplex, as a house would be hard to sell if we ended up leaving the area. Words are inadequate to express how deeply and positively I was impacted by this community working unitedly in response to the fire and its commitment to rebuild. That summer, I bought academic attire. And that fall, Mary Beth and I purchased our first home. All would be well. Clarke lived then. Clarke lives now. Thank you for your kind attention. Thank you. I would be pleased to entertain some questions if there are some. Now I can see if a hand goes up. Questions? Yes.
So when you're talking about the tunnel between the
Yes.
two sides of the street when we were walking in, why did they originally close it?
Okay, the question was, why was the tunnel closed? In 1979, so this is 2 years before I arrived on this campus, they built a student union in the lower level of Mary Frances Clarke Hall. And where the tunnel entered Mary Fran at that place was right where the kitchen was. So they were not going to have students walking in and out through a kitchen used to cook for that space. The tunnel still exists, but it only goes up to the statue of Mary Frances Clarke from Mary Fran Hall, and then all the piping today is buried. Yeah. I taught a course for years on the history of this institution here at Clarke, and the students always said, the thing we like best is to see the tunnel. And the tunnel was aesthetically displeasing. You had to duck to not hit your head on things, and you had to walk across boards in the middle because seeped water collected there. But
And there were frequently bats.
oh, well, I haven't seen that, but that's another issue. There were bats in the old buildings as well. That's kind of common. Other questions, please? Yes. My recollection is that first year was a tough year of recruitment because we could, it's hard to say anything other than those wonderful buildings look like remains in the middle of the campus. And you're trying to really recruit the incoming class that summer and fall the year before. But once deconstruction was occurring and you had the models of what it was going to be, then there was a lot of excitement. Yes?
One of the firefighters.
Oh, could you stand up, please? Or wave? Is there a... Oh.
I was a school liaison officer in the city, so I was living in senior high school when the fire alarm came in. So I came over, got in a car, and I was in civics. I bent the pad on my belt and started moving people across the street.
Yeah.
During that time, my first cousin taught me Judy Megan.
Oh, Judy, yes.
I had seen her across the street. When I first got here, you could see the smoke coming out of the eaves. About a half an hour after I was here, two of the windows in one of the top floors blew out, landed probably 20 feet from it. About that time, Judy's husband comes running up the street, yelling at me, "Jack, you seen Judy?" I said, "Yeah, she's across the street now. I don't know where." So he went over there.
Yeah.
But it was a very interesting and long day.
Thank you for your service. And if I live to be 90, I will remember all those popping windows because the heat and the pressure that formed were blowing out windows throughout the afternoon the day of the fire. Yes. Oh, yes, Louise.
Norm, I would just be interested in how many people here tonight were
Okay, the question is, how many here tonight were here that day? Would you raise your hand if you were here that day? And if you weren't here that day, but you were in Dubuque at that time, would you raise your hand? Quite a few people. And if you were not born yet, you can raise your hand too. Other questions? Yes, Father Dan.
I'm interested in the nomenclature. What is the large, it's a dormitory building that was the first one built across the street that the tunnel goes to. What's the name of that building?
That's Mary Frances Clarke Hall.
It's still Mary Frances?
Yeah, the original Mary Frances Clarke was that littler one in back, but in 1924, when the new building opened, that ceased to be a dorm.
They built that in 28,
Yeah.
figuring out when the buildings were built
Yeah.
across the street. Okay, good.
Yeah, last year was a centennial of groundbreaking for that building. 100 now.
That was original dormitory building separate, is that it?
It was the first building built exclusively for dormitory use. Because that first Mary Fran Hall and back was built as a conservatory and guest house was its original use. It's 100, yeah. Yeah. Other questions? Yes. It was in excess of 10 million, somewhere between 10, 12, or 13. Do you remember, Catherine, what the question was, what was the cost to rebuild? 15.3, and the building's value was around the 10 million range. But there was a funding campaign. When those buildings opened, they were all paid for. Yeah.
Can you ask her what the first check was that she got if she remembers?
Well, I don't know. Can you share, Catherine, what the first offer was from the insurance company or not?
Oh, yeah, it was, 3.5 million. If we had not brought in that company to test, which cost $60,000, and the board just looked at me like, are you crazy, lady? $60,000, but that 60,000 took it from 3.5 million to 9.5 million.
Yeah. Maybe time for a couple more questions. Yes, Mr. Wittry. I can't foresee the future. But I always remember that photograph of the practicing senior baseball students, and Clarke is just burning horrifically, and no one's looking at the fire. They're pitching and hitting, and life goes on. Yeah. One more question, I guess. Yes, Mary.
What happened to the pine walk that was so?
Well, it was a very forested campus for a long time. And then I think a stage of maturity of a lot of those trees were reached. And there were a period of a few generations where they weren't being replaced. And then it became less forested. We have worked very hard in recent years to plant lots and lots of trees now here. But a few of those trees from the original pine walk still remain.
And do you know when they put in South Locust all the way up to Senior? And Senior was built in 1920 something, is that right? 20?
Well, when we moved here, Father Dan, in 1881, that street was already back there. And the street out here was called Seminary Street at that time. Yeah, yeah. Well, I think we probably have to say adieu, but I hope you enjoyed it.
We can continue the conversation out in the atrium. There should be cookies and lemonade out there for you, and also possibly still some books if you would like to pick one up. But thank you so much for coming.